She stepped off the stagecoach in Bear Creek, Montana with one bag of secret hidden under her sleeve and three strangers waiting in the dust who had no idea what they had just agreed to take in. Neither did she. What happened next would change all four of them in ways none of them could have predicted on that September afternoon in 1876. And it begins the moment she looked not at the men waiting for her, but at the exits. She did not look like a woman running for her life. That was the first thing Beckett Calloway noticed when the stagecoach rolled to a stop on the main street of Bear Creek, Montana territory on a Thursday afternoon in September of 1876. The dust had barely settled when the door swung open and a young woman stepped down onto the wooden platform with the kind of careful, deliberate movements that spoke not of grace, but of someone who had learned through long practice to take up as little space as possible. She was small. That was the second thing he noticed. Small in the way that made the mountains behind Bear Creek look even larger than they already were, as though the landscape itself was pressing down on her. She wore a navy blue traveling dress that had once been fine and was now simply clean, the fabric faded at the elbows, the lace at the collar carefully pressed but beginning to fray at the edges. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up in the manner fashionable back east, though several strands had escaped during the long journey and now caught the late afternoon light like threads of copper and gold. Her eyes, when she finally looked up from the platform, were the color of a mountain lake in early summer. Blue-green, deep, and impossible to read. She clutched a single valise in both hands, one bag for an entire life. Beckett stood beside the wagon with his two brothers flanking him, and none of the three Calloway men said a word. They had agreed on this beforehand, more or less, though the agreement had been less a conversation and more the natural silence that falls between men who have lived together long enough to communicate without speaking. They would let her settle. They would not overwhelm her. They would give her room to breathe. What none of them had anticipated was how completely she would ignore them. Josephine Hartwell, who went by Josie and had, since she was old enough to correct people about it, stepped off the platform and spent a full 30 seconds looking not at the three large men waiting for her, but at the town itself. She turned her head slowly, deliberately, the way a person does when they are cataloging exits. The general store to the left, the sheriff's office 2 doors down, the livery at the far end of the street, the church on the hill above the town, its white paint bright against the darkening sky. Only after she had mapped the town to her own satisfaction did she turn and look at the Calloways. She studied each of them in turn. Rafferty watched her do it and thought privately that she had the eyes of a woman who had been surprised badly once before and intended never to be surprised again. Beckett stepped forward. He was the tallest of the three brothers, though all of them stood well above 6 feet, the natural result of a lifetime of mountain living and physical labor. He was 34 years old with dark chestnut hair that had begun to show the first threads of silver at the temples, amber eyes that his mother had once called the color of good whiskey, and a jaw that could have been quarried from the rock of the nearby peaks. He had removed his hat when the stagecoach appeared, though he held it now at his side rather than placing it back on his head. It was the most formal gesture available to him. "You are Josie Hartwell," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. It was a composed voice, precise in its diction, the voice of a woman educated beyond what frontier life generally produced. But beneath the composure, beneath the careful articulation, Beckett heard something else. He had spent enough years in these mountains, enough seasons reading weather and terrain and the behavior of animals under stress to hear it clearly. She was afraid. Not of him specifically, not of the town or the brothers or the wide open sky of Montana territory. She was afraid in the way a person is afraid when they have made a choice so desperate, so final, so completely irreversible that the only thing left to do is walk forward and pray the ground holds. "I am Beckett Calloway," he said. "These are my brothers, Fletcher and Rafferty. The ranch is 4 miles up the valley. The wagon is here." He paused. "Do you want to get in?" Not an order, not quite an invitation either, just the honest laying out of circumstances, which was for Beckett Calloway as close to gentle as he generally managed. Josie Hartwell looked at the wagon. She looked at the three brothers standing beside it. She looked once more at the town of Bear Creek, and then she looked back at Beckett, and something moved across her face that he could not entirely name. It was not resignation. It was not despair. It was something harder than either of those things and quieter and somehow more determined. She walked to the wagon and got in, 4 miles up the valley then, and a life beginning. They had not traveled a half mile before Beckett spoke again. This was unusual. Fletcher, sitting in the back of the wagon with Josie's single valise between his boots, noticed it immediately. Beckett was not a man who explained himself unnecessarily. He was not a man who explained himself at all as a general rule. He made decisions and he acted on them, and people could draw their own conclusions. But he spoke now, his eyes on the road ahead, his hands easy on the reins, and what he said was simply the truth, laid out without decoration the way he believed truth ought to be delivered. He told her about the advertisement. He told her that he had written it himself over the course of 3 separate evenings and that every version he had produced had come out wrong, too formal or too desperate or too opaque, until finally he had settled on something that was accurate if not entirely complete. He told her that he and his brothers needed someone to manage the household, that their mother had died in November of 1874 from a lung illness that came on fast and allowed no time for preparation, that their sister Rosalind had died in the spring of 1875 in circumstances he did not elaborate on, leaving the house with a silence in it that 3 men alone could not fill. He told her that any arrangement between them was hers to make and hers to end, that no obligation extended beyond what she chose to accept, that if she arrived at the ranch, spent a week looking at the mountains and the mud, and the considerable distance between Bear Creek and anything resembling civilization, and decided she wanted to go home, he would put her on the next southbound stage himself and pay her passage. Fletcher watched Josie from the corner of his eye while Beckett talked. He was 31 years old, 2 years younger than Beckett, and 3 years older than Rafferty, the middle brother, in all the ways the phrase implied. He was the most observant of the three, the one who noticed things and filed them away and said nothing until he had thought them through completely. He watched Josie's hands in her lap, and he watched her face in profile, and when Beckett finished speaking, he watched her absorb what had been said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a single question. "Why 3 of you?" It was Rafferty who answered. Rafferty, the youngest, who sat on the far side of the wagon bench and had said nothing since Bear Creek, who had spent the entire drive looking at the mountains with the particular expression of a man thinking about something that happened a year ago and had not left him alone since. "Because all 3 of us wanted this house to have someone in it," he said without looking at her. "But none of us knew how to ask alone." Josie did not respond to this, but Fletcher saw her hands, which had been knotted tightly together in her lap since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach, loosen slightly. Just slightly, enough to notice if you were watching. He was watching. The Calloway Ranch sat on a long bench of land 300 feet above the valley floor, backed by a stand of cottonwood and aspen that flared gold in the September light and sheltered the buildings from the worst of the winter wind. The main house was built from Montana lodgepole pine squared and fitted tight, a structure that had begun as one large room in 1858 when Silas Calloway first drove his wagon up from the valley and decided this was the place he intended to stay, and had grown steadily since, room by room, addition by addition, until it sprawled across the hillside in a way that made architectural sense only if you understood the order in which the years had passed. It was not beautiful in any formal sense of the word. It was solid, it was real, the kind of structure that communicated without needing to say anything that the people who built it intended to remain. Josie looked at it for a long moment from the wagon seat before she climbed down. She climbed down on her own. Beckett had moved to assist her, and she had flinched. It was a small movement, barely perceptible. The kind of reflex that happens before the conscious mind can intervene, the pulling back of someone who has been grabbed suddenly and often enough that the body simply responds to the approach of a large hand with a language older than thought. Beckett stopped. He did not step back dramatically. He did not make a show of stepping away. He simply became very still, his hand half raised, and then he lowered it to his side. Fletcher saw it. Rafferty saw it. Neither of them spoke. Josie climbed down from the wagon unaided, smoothed her dress, picked up her valise, and looked at the house. That evening, alone in the wagon yard, the three brothers stood in the cooling September air and said the thing that had to be said. "Someone hurt her," Beckett said. His voice was flat, not without feeling precisely. More like feeling that had been compressed into something dense and controlled. Fletcher said, "I know." Rafferty said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the house at the lit window of the room they had prepared for her, the one with the new lock on the door that he had walked 3 miles into Bear Creek to purchase the week before because it had seemed to him the kind of thing a person might need. He said quietly, "What do we do?" Beckett said. "Nothing. Not yet. She'll say when she's ready. Until then, she is safe here." Those words settled over the yard like the first light snow of an early season. Quiet, covering everything. Inside the house in the room with the new lock, Josie Hartwell stood at the small window and looked out at the mountains in the last of the daylight. She had heard them. The walls of the house were solid, but sound carried in the September stillness, and she had heard every word. She had been called many things in the 6 months since her father died. Ungrateful, disobedient, too proud for her own good, a burden most recently and most memorably. She had never until this moment been called safe. She stood at the window a long time. The mountains held their shape against the darkening sky. Below, she could hear the brothers moving about the yard, the ordinary sounds of men tending animals and closing up outbuildings for the night. The kind of sounds she had not heard since her father was alive, and their house in Boston still felt like a house rather than something she had been locked inside. She breathed in, she breathed out. She did not cry. She had not cried since March, and she did not intend to start now. 3 days passed. They were not simple days exactly, but they were uncomplicated ones. Josie learned the layout of the house. She learned the temperament of the wood-burning stove in the kitchen, which required patience and a specific combination of kindling and coal that she mastered on her second attempt after incinerating a pot of corn mush on the first. She learned that Beckett rose before dawn every morning, that Fletcher took his coffee black and strong and could be found most evenings at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of him, and that Rafferty often disappeared into the workshop behind the barn for hours at a time, emerging smelling of sawdust and linseed oil, with the look of a man who had been somewhere private and necessary. She did not learn in those 3 days how to stop watching the door. It was an old habit. From the time her father's health had begun to fail, and her Uncle Cornelius had started making himself comfortable in their household with increasing frequency, she had developed a sense for doors, where they were, whether they were open or closed, whether the person on the other side of one was approaching or moving away. She knew the particular weight of a heavy footstep in a hallway. She knew the difference between a hand resting on a door handle and a hand gripping one. Here the doors were different. They opened and closed without violence. The footsteps in the hallway were large, but they were careful, the way men are careful when they are aware of their own size and do not wish to use it as a weapon. On the evening of the third day, Harriet Doyle came to call. Harriet was 55 years old, a widow of 5 years, and the owner of the nearest neighboring property, which sat a mile and a half down the valley road. She was a broad, direct, Irish-born woman who had come west with her husband Emmett 30 years earlier and had outlasted him in the frontier winters and 2 droughts and 1 very bad spring flood, and she approached the world with the practical confidence of someone who has survived enough to know that most things can be survived. She arrived at the ranch house door with a tin of ginger biscuits and a pot of something hot wrapped in cloth, and she settled herself at the kitchen table as though she had been doing it for years, which in a sense she had. She and Josie talked for an hour about ordinary things. Bear Creek, the school that had been proposed and abandoned and proposed again. The Anderson family over the ridge, their 7 children, their excellent apple trees. The particular qualities of Montana winter, which Harriet described without sentiment as a thing to be respected and prepared for. And then Harriet said casually, still looking at her tea, "My husband Emmett was not always a kind man in the early years, before he understood what kind of man he wanted to be." Josie did not respond. "He had a temper," Harriet said, "and I was young and far from home, and I thought for a long time that it was something I had done or something I had failed to do." She turned her cup in her hands. "It took me longer than it should have to understand that it was not about me at all, that the thing living in him had nothing to do with me." Josie was quiet. "I noticed things," Harriet said, "the way a person holds their shoulders, the way they sit facing the room, the way they startle at a hand raised in an ordinary gesture." She looked at Josie, then direct and without apology. "I noticed those things because I spent a long time watching for them in myself." The kitchen was warm. The fire was low. Outside, the September darkness had come down fully over the mountains. "My uncle," Josie said. She said it the way a person says a thing they have not said aloud before testing the sound of it in a room with someone else present hearing, whether it collapses or holds. "After my father died, I went to stay with him. He was not kind." Harriet nodded. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say it must have been terrible. She reached across the table and placed her weathered, capable hand over Josie's, and she said, "You came to the right place." Josie looked at her. "Those three," Harriet said with a slight motion of her head toward the window and the yard beyond it, "look like mountains. They act like mountains. They speak about as often as mountains do." She paused. "But I have known those boys since Beckett was 19 years old and Rafferty was barely shaving. They do not raise their hands. Not once, not ever." Josie said, "How can you be certain?" "Because," Harriet said, "I watched Beckett Calloway spend 6 months carrying food up to the Whitmore family after their father broke his leg without ever mentioning it to anyone. Because I watched Rafferty sit with his sister through a night I would not describe to you, a night no one should have sat through alone, and hold her hand until it was over." She paused again. "And because," she said more quietly, "when Beckett's father used to raise his voice at their mother, which was not often, but was not never either, it was always Beckett who stood between them." The fire settled in the stove. A piece of wood shifted and fell. "You are safe here," Harriet said. "I give you my word on that, and my word has lasted 55 years in fair weather and poor." That same night after Harriet had gone and the house had grown quiet, Josie went to her room and found on the small table beside the bed the key to her door. She had been given it the first evening, pressed into her and by Beckett, without explanation or fanfare, and she had put it in her pocket and carried it there, turning it over with her thumb whenever she thought about it. She thought about it often. She had lived for 6 months in a house where the locks were on the outside of the doors, where the key to her own room had been held by someone else, and the holding of it had been understood by everyone involved, including Josie, to be a demonstration of something, of who was in control, of what her choices were and were not. She sat on the edge of the bed in the new room in the Calloway Ranch house and turned the key over in her hand and thought about who had put the lock on this door. She had assumed it was Beckett. Beckett seemed like the kind of man who would think of practical things, who would identify the need for something and provide it without discussion. She found out 2 weeks later that it had been Rafferty. That Rafferty had walked the 3 miles into Bear Creek one afternoon the week before her arrival, spent 20 minutes in conversation with the hardware merchant, and walked the 3 miles back with a lock and 2 keys, and had fitted the lock to her door that same evening without saying a word to either of his brothers about why. When she found out, she was standing in the kitchen doorway, and Rafferty was at the table with the clock again, the small carriage clock with the cracked face that she had noticed the first day and had been quietly curious about ever since. The light was failing outside, and he was working by lamplight, and she watched him for a moment before she spoke. "The lock on my door," she said. "It was you." He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression was that of a man who had been found out in something private and was deciding whether to be embarrassed by it. The old lock was broken, he said, which was not an answer. Why, she asked. He was quiet for a moment, his thumb resting on one of the clock's small gears. Then he said, because it seemed like the kind of thing someone might need, coming somewhere new, not knowing anyone. Josie leaned against the door frame. The kitchen smelled of pine resin and coffee, and the particular smell of old wood that has been warm for a long time. Whose clock is that? He looked back down at it. My sister's, he said, Rosalind's. She liked blue, Josie said. He looked up sharply. She had mentioned this once before in passing and had not expected him to carry it. But she had been carrying it herself, this small piece of a person she had never met, this fragment of color that felt like a way to make Rosalind real, rather than simply a name in the silence. How did you know I was thinking about that? He said. I was also thinking about it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read. It was not suspicion. It was not quite wonder. It was something between the two, the look of a person who has been seen clearly and is still deciding how to feel about it. Blue, he said, dark blue like the sky just after the sun goes all the way down. She said there was no good name for that color. Indigo, Josie said, or cobalt, though neither one really captures it. Rafferty considered this. No, he agreed, neither one does. He looked back at the clock. Josie stayed in the doorway a little longer, and when she finally turned to go, she felt for the first time since she had arrived in Montana territory, something that she could not immediately name. It was not comfort exactly. Not yet. It was the precondition of comfort. The slight loosening of something she had been holding for a very long time. It arrived on a Wednesday. The letter. It came with the regular post, which ran once a week through Bear Creek on its way up through the valley towns, and it was handed to Josie by the postmaster's boy at the general store on a Wednesday morning when she had ridden into town with Harriet to purchase flour and candle wax and a length of dark wool for curtains. The handwriting on the envelope was familiar. Of course it was familiar. She had been seeing it for 6 months on instruction cards left on the kitchen table, on notes slid under doors on formal correspondence designed to be discovered by others as evidence of what a conscientious guardian Cornelius Hartwell was to his orphaned niece. She stood in the dust outside the general store and held the envelope and did not open it. Harriet was watching her from the wagon, and Harriet was quiet in the way Harriet was quiet when she had understood something and was waiting to see what happened next. Josie put the letter in her coat pocket. She climbed up onto the wagon bench. She said, we still need the wool fabric. They bought the wool. They drove back up the valley. They said nothing about the letter. That evening at supper, Beckett looked at Josie across the table. Not intrusively, not with the pointed, loaded look of a man who expects to be told something. Just a look that said he was present and paying attention and would be there if there was something to be said. Fletcher ate with his eyes on his plate. Rafferty passed the bread without being asked. After supper, Josie went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the letter. Cornelius Hartwell's handwriting was precise and controlled, the handwriting of a man who believed that appearances were the substance of things and that everything could be managed if it was simply managed firmly enough. He wrote that he was her guardian. He wrote that he was aware of her current situation, that the details had reached him through channels he did not specify, and that he found her circumstances both irregular and, from a legal perspective, problematic. He wrote that under the terms of the guardianship established in her father's will, her residence in the household of 3 unmarried men, to whom she bore no legal relationship, was a matter that could be addressed by the courts. He wrote that the provisions governing her inheritance, specifically the clause that transferred control of her father's estate to her legal guardian in the event that she failed to make a proper marriage by the first day of January 1878, remained in full effect regardless of where she chose to reside. He wrote that she had 60 days to return to Boston. He wrote at the bottom in the same controlled hand that if she did not, he would come himself. Josie read the letter twice. She folded it along its original creases. She held it in her hands for a moment and looked at the window at the last of the light going out of the Montana sky, the mountains dark against a darkening field. She thought about the lock on her door. She thought about Rafferty walking 3 miles to buy it. She thought about Beckett's voice in the yard 3 days after she arrived. She is safe here. She thought about her father's desk in the house in Boston, where she had found the will after he died and had read the guardianship clause and had understood for the first time what the next several years of her life were likely to look like if she stayed. She thought about the night she had packed the single valise, the night she had taken the money she had been hiding for 4 months coin by coin and folded it into the lining of her coat, the night she had written the letter to Calloway Ranch and walked 6 blocks in the cold to the post office to send it before she could change her mind. She had not changed her mind. She put the letter from Cornelius in the small leather case she kept under the bed. She smoothed it flat against the others, the one she had been keeping since March, the record of a man who believed he was untouchable because he had always been untouchable. Then she stood up, straightened her dress, and went back out to the kitchen. Beckett was still at the table alone now, a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, looking at nothing in particular with the look of a man doing his thinking where he could see the fire. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him. She put her hands flat on the table. She said, "There is something you should know. I would like to tell you about it. Not because I need you to fix it, but because you offered me shelter, and I think you should understand what you offered it to." Beckett set down his coffee cup. He folded his hands in front of him. He looked at her with the quiet, complete attention of a man who knows how to wait for things. And Josie Hartwell, who had not told the full truth to anyone since her father was alive, began to speak. She told him about her father, who had been a good man and an unwary one, who had loved her with uncomplicated sincerity and had trusted his brother Cornelius with the administration of his affairs because he had trusted everyone, because trust had always served him well, and he had not recognized at the end of his life how thoroughly that trust had been arranged against him. She told him about the will. She told him about the clause, the provision that transferred control of her inheritance to Cornelius in the event that she remained unmarried by the 1st of January, 1878. She told him that her father had not understood what he was signing, that the language had been made deliberately complex, that Cornelius had been present at the signing and had explained it in terms that were accurate without being honest. She told him about the 6 months after her father died. She did not dwell on this part. She gave it its shape and its weight, and then she moved past it because dwelling was not something she was willing to do. She had not come 4,000 feet up into the Montana mountains to dwell. She told him enough so that he understood why she had flinched when his hand had come toward her. She told him enough so that the single valise made sense. She told him about the letter. Beckett listened. He did not interrupt. He did not reach across the table to touch her hands, though she could see something in him that seemed to want to. He sat with the weight of what she was saying and held it the way a man holds a thing when he is not sure yet what to do with it, but he is absolutely certain he will not put it down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do about it? Not what I want, not what seems practical. What do you want?" She looked at him. He said, "You have been asked that recently. I can tell by the way you look when I ask it." "No," she said, "I have not been asked that recently." He nodded. "Then I am asking now." The fire burned in the stove. Outside, the Montana night had settled over the valley, cool and enormous and indifferent to the business of human beings. Inside the kitchen in the house, with the new lock on the bedroom door and 3 brothers who had not asked her a single question she was not ready to answer, Josie Hartwell sat across from a man who had just offered her for the first time in 6 months the courtesy of her own choices. She did not answer him that night. She needed to think. But she looked at Beckett Calloway across the kitchen table, and she looked at him without flinching, and something shifted in the architecture of the fear she had been living inside for a very long time. Something small, something that mattered. 4 miles up the valley from the town of Bear Creek, on a bench of land above the trees, in a house built year by year from the stone and timber of the mountains, a woman who had arrived with 1 bag and 1 secret in a flinch She could not control, had just done something she had not done since March. She had told the truth, and the walls had not fallen down. October came to Bear Creek the way it always did in the high country. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the mountains had simply decided overnight that summer had gone on long enough. The aspens along the creek bottom turned gold in the space of 3 days, and the mornings carried a sharpness that made the air taste like iron and pine resin, and the light that fell across the valley had the particular quality of light in high places in autumn, clear and slightly melancholy, as though it understood it was running out of time. Josie noticed all of it. She had spent her entire life in Boston, where autumn meant damp streets and the smell of coal smoke and leaves pasted to brick sidewalks, where the season announced itself in increments and could be ignored if a person was sufficiently indoors. Here there was no ignoring it. The mountains did not allow for that kind of inattention. They demanded that you look at them, and what they showed you in October was something so large and so indifferent and so beautiful that it required a certain readjustment of the self just to stand in it. She stood on the porch of the ranch house most mornings before anyone else was up, watching the light change on the peaks to the west, and she thought about the letter in the leather case under her bed, and she thought about the deadline it contained, and she thought about what Beckett had asked her the night she finally told him the truth. What do you want? She was still working on the answer. The first riding lesson happened on a Tuesday 10 days after her arrival because Beckett announced at breakfast that it was going to happen, and then went out to saddle Chester before she could object. Chester was a broad, patient bay gelding of indeterminate age who had the resigned expression of an animal that had seen too many beginners and had made his peace with the situation. He stood in the yard with his ears at half attention while Beckett checked the saddle, and Josie stood beside him with her arms at her sides, looking at the stirrup height and making calculations. "You have ridden before," Beckett said. It was an observation, not a question. "Side saddle," she said, "in a park, at a pace that would not have concerned a grandmother." "That will not serve you here," he said. He was not unkind about it. He was simply honest the way the mountains were honest, without varnish or softening. Side saddle on this terrain means falls. It means injuries. It means you cannot move fast enough when fast is what is needed. He showed her the correct position. His hands stayed on the saddle and the stirrup leathers and the reins. They did not come near her. She understood this was deliberate, and she was grateful for it in a way she did not say aloud and suspected she did not need to. She got into the saddle. Chester accepted this without protest. The lesson lasted 2 hours. She fell once into a pile of cut hay near the fence, which softened the landing considerably and which she was privately certain had not been placed there by accident. Harriet Doyle, who had arrived at some point during the proceedings and was now sitting on the fence rail with a tin cup of coffee, laughed when Josie hit the hay, a full and genuine laugh that carried no mockery in it, only the delight of someone who has watched the same scene play out many times before and still finds it genuinely funny. Beckett appeared at the edge of the hay pile and extended his hand. Josie looked at it. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, which was approximately 1 second less than she would have needed the week before. Then she took it. He pulled her upright. He stepped back. He said again. She went again. By the end of the second hour, she was not good, but she was no longer a danger to herself or the horse. And Beckett said so in exactly those words, and coming from him, it landed as a considerable compliment. On the ride back to the barn, she sat the saddle with a tentative but genuine confidence. And Chester, who had apparently decided she was acceptable, walked with the easy swing of an animal that is finally going home. Fletcher was at the fence when they came in. He had been there, she realized, for at least the last half hour, though she had not noticed him until now. He was leaning on the top rail with his arms crossed, watching her dismount, with the assessing look he brought to most things, the look of a man taking inventory. "Not bad," he said. From Fletcher, she was already beginning to understand this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The stove incident happened 3 days later. She had made corn mush successfully twice and had concluded she understood the stove. She did not understand the stove. The stove was a large cast-iron creature of specific and demanding temperament that operated on principles of coal and draft and timing that she had not yet fully grasped. And on the morning in question, it expressed its displeasure by bringing the pot to a boil approximately 4 times faster than she had anticipated and producing something that could be fairly described as corn mortar. Fletcher walked into the kitchen to find her standing over the pot with a wooden spoon and an expression she was working hard to keep neutral. He looked at the pot. He looked at the spoon. He looked at her. He took the pot off the stove without comment. He set it in the yard. He came back inside, took a second pot from the shelf, filled it with water from the pitcher, and put it on the stove. Then he turned and said, "The draft lever, left of the firebox. Pull it half open before you add coal, not after." She looked at the lever she had not known existed. "Full open gives you too much air," he said. "The fire burns too hot and too fast. Half open is consistent, predictable." He paused. "The stove is not trying to ruin your breakfast. It is just doing what it does. You have to work with it." He said all of this the way he said most things, directly, without apology or condescension, as though the information were simply available and passing it along was the obvious thing to do. There was no implication that she should have known. There was no performance of patience, no visible effort to be kind. He was just telling her something useful. She was discovering the language Fletcher spoke most fluently. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back out to whatever he had been doing. The second pot of corn mush cooked perfectly. She made a note about the draft lever in the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, which was filling up with the particular knowledge of this place, the kind of knowledge that could not be learned from books and had to be earned one mistake at a time. She asked Rafferty about the clock on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when the sky came down low over the valley and the light turned the color of old pewter, and working outdoors became more stubbornness than practicality. She had seen him at the table with it multiple times by then, always in the evenings or on days when the weather drove him inside, always with the same careful, unhurried attention that she found both striking and familiar, because it reminded her of the way her father had repaired things with a tenderness that communicated how much the thing mattered. She sat down across from him. She watched him work for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been working on it?" 8 months, and he said, "Since she died." He looked up. She had not mentioned Rosalind by name. He had not told her. But she had pieced it together from Harriet's careful words, and the way the 3 brothers moved around the fact of their sister, the way people move around a piece of furniture that has been there so long, they no longer see it, but cannot imagine the room without it. "Since she died," he confirmed. "What stopped it?" "The mainspring broke," he said, "when she fell." He paused, and she heard in the pause the story. He was not telling the story of how a clock stops when someone drops it and why someone might drop it and everything that follows from that. "I could not find the right part until June. Ordered it from a clockmaker in Helena." He returned to the work. She watched his hands, which were large and calloused from ranch labor, working the tiny internal mechanisms of the clock with a precision that seemed almost improbable until you understood that care and size are not in contradiction. "She kept it on her windowsill," he said after a while. "Said it helped her sleep. The sound of it." "A ticking clock," Josie said. "My mother had one like that. In our hallway. I used to fall asleep listening to it when I was very small." Rafferty looked at her with the expression she had seen before, the one that was not quite wonder and not quite recognition, but lived somewhere between the two. "Your mother," he said. "She's gone." "When I was 12, Josie said. "Fever." He nodded slowly. He turned the clock over in his hands. "Rosalind was 23, he said. "She would have been 24 in December." The rain moved across the roof in sheets, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and they sat with the weight of what had been said in the comfortable way that sometimes happens between people who have both been carrying something heavy for a long time and find unexpectedly that the other person understands the specific shape of the weight. "I think she would have liked you," Rafferty said, finally looking back at the clock. He said it the way a person says something they have been thinking for a while and have decided is true enough to say aloud. Josie did not answer immediately. She let the words settle. Then she said, "I think I would have liked her." The evening by the fire happened on the third Friday of October, and it happened because Fletcher brought out the whiskey. He produced it from the back of the pantry shelf with the air of a man performing a ritual, which in some sense he was. Harriet had mentioned in passing that the Calloway brothers kept a bottle of good Tennessee whiskey for what they called occasions, and that the last occasion had been Rafferty's birthday the previous winter, and before that the completion of the new barn roof. The definition of occasion was by frontier standards suitably austere. Fletcher poured 4 small measures into 4 tin cups and distributed them around the kitchen table without asking whether anyone wanted one, which was itself a kind of courtesy, the courtesy of assuming that people could speak up for themselves if the assumption was wrong. They sat. The fire burned low. Outside, the October night pressed against the windows. Fletcher said without particular preamble, "Tell me about Boston." Josie turned her cup in her hands. She thought about which version of Boston to offer, the version that was true and the version that was useful, and decided that at this table on this evening, with these 3 men who had not asked her a single dishonest question, the true version was also the useful one. She told them about her father's study, which smelled of book leather and pipe tobacco, in which she had been allowed to visit every evening after supper to sit in the chair by the window while he read aloud. She told them about the harbor visible from the hill above their street and how she had always been able to tell the weather by the color of it. She told them about her mother's garden, which had continued to bloom for 3 years after her mother died, because Josie had tended it with the single-mindedness of grief, and then had gone to seed the summer she finally stopped. She did not tell them about Cornelius. Not that night. That story had its own time, and she had already given Beckett the outline of it, and the outline was enough for now. Fletcher said, after she had been talking for a while, "I climbed the Bear Tooth the first time when I was 19. He said it the way he said most things, without introduction or explanation, as though the relevance were obvious. Alone. Took 3 days there and back. The second night I made camp on a ledge about 400 feet below the summit, and I lay on my back and looked at the sky and thought that I had never understood before that moment how large a thing it was possible to be inside of." Josie looked at him. "I mean the sky," he said, "the amount of it." "I understood," she said. He nodded. He looked at his cup. He said, "I came back and I never told anyone where I had been or what I had seen, because it seemed like the kind of thing that only stays true if you keep it for yourself." He paused. "I do not know why I just told you that." Josie said, "Perhaps it has been long enough." Fletcher considered this. "Perhaps it has," he agreed. Beckett said nothing during any of this, which was normal, but he was present in the way he was always present, which was completely the way a large and steady thing is present, the way a mountain is present when you are standing at its base. Rafferty added a piece of wood to the fire when it was needed. The whiskey was very good. The evening was, Josie realized, somewhere in the middle of it, the first evening in 6 months that she had spent in a room with other people without any part of her being occupied with watching for signs of what was coming next. She was simply there. She filed it away carefully, the way she filed away information about draft levers and trail gradients and the best way to keep a wood stove burning through the night. Useful knowledge, the kind that was hard to come by and worth keeping. The moment by the bookshelf happened without planning, the way the significant moments in a life generally do. She had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf of the sitting room bookcase, a natural history of the Northern Territories that she had noticed on her second day and had been meaning to take down ever since. The shelf was higher than it looked. She stretched up on her toes, her fingertips just grazing the spine, and her balance shifted, and she felt herself beginning to tip. Beckett was behind her. She did not know he had come into the room. She had not heard him. He moved quietly for a man his size, the quietness of a man who has learned that mountains do not reward noise. His hand came to the small of her back, steadying her, one hand present for exactly the moment it was needed and then gone. She straightened. She was not sure how long she stood without moving. "The book," he said, his voice behind her, and reached past her and took it from the shelf and held it out. She took it. She turned around. He was closer than she had registered, and she was looking up at him, and she was aware of several things simultaneously: that her heart was doing something irregular, that she was not frightened, and that the absence of fear was in itself something she needed to pay attention to. "Thank you," she said. "It is a good book," he said. "The section on the elk migration is accurate. The section on wolves is romanticized." She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way it came up fast and unexpected from somewhere she had not expected to find it. She controlled it, but only just, and she thought she saw something in his expression that recognized the almost laugh and was quietly pleased by it. He stepped back. The ordinary space of the room reasserted itself. She went and sat by the window and opened the book, and she read about the elk migration and later about the wolves, and she thought that romanticize was probably the right word for it, and that Beckett Calloway had read widely for a man who lived 4 miles from the nearest town and communicated primarily in statements of observable fact. She thought about his hand at her back, present and then gone, exactly what was needed and nothing more. She turned a page. The argument with Fletcher happened on a November morning, the first week of the month, when the frost was coming down hard at night, and the creek had developed a skim of ice along its edges. She had been in the ranch office, which was a small room off the main hallway that contained a desk, a filing cabinet, and the ledgers in which the ranch's financial records were kept. She had gone in to find paper for a letter she intended to write to Harriet's Denver contact, the lawyer Harriet had mentioned, because she had been thinking carefully about Cornelius and the deadline and the options available to her, and she had been thinking about them long enough to want to do something rather than simply continue thinking. She had found the ledgers open on the desk and had made the mistake, or what Fletcher considered a mistake, of looking at them. She had not been able to help it. Numbers arranged in columns were to Josie what a trail through the woods was to a man like Beckett, a thing that invited reading, that told a story if you knew how to follow it. She had grown up watching her father manage accounts, had understood the language of ledgers since childhood, and what she saw in the Calloway Ranch accounts told a story that needed correcting. The land tax entry for the past 2 years was wrong, not by a little. The error had compounded as errors in ledgers do, and the result was that the ranch had been overpaying its county assessment by a meaningful sum and would continue to do so unless someone who understood the calculation pointed out where the calculation had gone wrong. She had made a note of it on a slip of paper. She had left the note on top of the open ledger. She had gone to find the paper she originally came for. Fletcher found the note before she came back. He was in the office doorway when she returned, holding the slip of paper, and his expression was the one he wore when he was engaged in the rapid internal process of deciding what he thought about something. "You went through the accounts," he said. The words were level. They were not shouted, but they were not friendly either, and they contained beneath their surface the particular tension of a man who has been looked at in a place he considers private. Josie stopped in the doorway. She felt the old reflex move through her, the instinct to apologize, to make herself smaller, to find the correct combination of words that would bring the temperature in the room back down. She felt it move through her, and she let it pass. "I found an error," she said, "a significant one. I made a note of it." Without asking. The ledger was open on the desk. That does not mean it was an invitation. She looked at him steadily. Fletcher was not a man who used his size as a weapon. She had established this by now. But he was a large man in a small doorway, and the geometry of the situation was not neutral. She was aware of it, and she did not move. "You are right," she said. "I should have asked before I sat down with the accounts. That was discourteous. I will ask in future." She paused. "But the error is real, and it is your money, and I thought you would want to know." He looked at the slip of paper. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not the anger it had been a moment ago, something more complicated, the particular expression of a man recalibrating. "Where?" he said. "The county assessment calculation. The formula changed 2 years ago. You have been applying the old rate to the new acreage." He looked at the note. He was quiet for a long moment. How much, he said. She told him. He was silent. He folded the note carefully. He put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at her with an expression that was as close to discomfort as she had seen on his face, the discomfort of a man who has been wrong in a way he cannot argue his way out of. I am sorry, he said, for the tone. And I am sorry for not asking first, she said. He nodded. He moved out of the doorway. He walked down the hallway toward the office, and she heard the sound of the ledger pages being turned, and she went to find her paper, and the temperature in the house was exactly what it had been before, no higher and no lower, and something between them had shifted into a different register. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the territory that warmth is built on. The bedrock under it, it was Harriet who told her about the other women. They were shelling dried beans on Harriet's porch on a gray afternoon in early November, the beans rattling against the tin bowls with a rhythm that made conversation easier rather than harder, and Harriet said in her particular way of saying things that she had been thinking about for some time. Did the boys tell you about the others? Josie looked up from the bowl. What others? The other women, Harriet said. Before you. Josie set a bean aside. No, she said, they did not. Harriet was quiet for a moment, her hands working steadily. Beckett ran the advertisement 7 times, she said. Over 2 years, 6 women came. None of them stayed longer than 3 weeks. Josie processed this. She thought about Beckett's face when she had arrived, the quality of stillness in it, the look of a man who has been waiting for something and is not entirely certain the waiting is over. She thought about the way all 3 brothers had watched her in those first days, not with possessiveness or demand, but with a kind of careful, suspended attention, the attention of people who have been disappointed before and are managing their expectations accordingly. Why did they leave? She said. Harriet considered. Different reasons on the surface, but underneath I think the same one. They came looking for a husband. They found 3 quiet men on a mountain a long way from everything they knew, and the distance was more than miles. She paused. This is a particular kind of life. Not everyone is built for it. There is no shame in that. Josie thought about this. She thought about the Boston house with its locked doors and its careful management of her movements and its constant low-level hum of threat. She thought about the letter in the leather case. She thought about the morning she had stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked at the mountains and felt for the first time in a very long time that the size of the world around her was a gift rather than a danger. What was I looking for? She said half to herself. I think, Harriet said, that you were looking for a place where you were allowed to be whatever size you actually are. And I think, she continued, returning to her beans, that you have found it, whether you have noticed that yet or not. Then Harriet told her about Rosalind's husband. She did not tell it all. She gave it its shape in the way a careful person gives the shape of something without every detail, because the details belong to the brothers and were theirs to share or not. But she told Josie enough, that Rosalind had married young a man who seemed well enough from the outside, the kind of man who managed his behavior in public and did not in private, that Beckett had found out too late, that he had ridden 3 days straight to get to her and had arrived to find that arriving was no longer the thing that was needed. Josie was quiet for a long time after that. He cannot fix what happened to her, Harriet said simply. But I believe he has decided that he will not stand by while the same thing happens to someone else. She paused. That was why he watched you so carefully on the platform in Bear Creek. Not to assess you, to see whether anyone had done to you what had been done to Rosalind. The beans rattled in the tin bowl, the November sky pressed down low and gray over the valley. Josie thought about the platform, about the flinch she could not control, about 3 sets of amber eyes that had changed color in different ways when they saw it. She thought about all the things that had not been said and had still been perfectly understood. The storm came on a Monday in the middle of November out of the northwest. The way the serious ones always came with a drop in temperature overnight that put ice on the inside of the windows by morning, and a wind that by afternoon was moving snow horizontally across the valley in sheets. Fletcher was at the Anderson place 1.5 miles over the ridge. Anderson had come off his horse on a rutted track 2 days earlier, When the animal slipped on frost and the resulting damage to Anderson's arm required assistance that his wife could not provide alone and that Fletcher had gone to offer. The storm caught him there, which left Beckett and Rafferty and Josie in the ranch house with 2 days of provisions, a full wood pile, and the particular intimacy of being the only human beings in a considerable radius during weather that made going outside an act of commitment. The first day was manageable. Beckett went out in the morning to check the stock and came back with ice in his beard and a detailed assessment of the barn roof's structural response to load-bearing snow. Josie and Rafferty managed the house, the fire, the cooking, the ordinary choreography of people sharing a space during a time that requires cooperation. The second day, the roof of the hay storage shed began to leak. The melt from the heat generated by the packed hay was finding its way through a crack that the snow's weight had opened, and the hay beneath was at risk of wetting, which in the economics of a cattle ranch in November is a serious problem. Beckett and Rafferty went out to address it. Josie put on her coat and Rafferty's spare hat and Beckett's second pair of work gloves, which were absurdly large on her, and she went out behind them. "Go back inside," Beckett said without turning around. He could apparently tell it was her by the sound of her footsteps. "Tell me what needs holding," she said. A pause. Rafferty looked over his shoulder at her. Something in his expression was close to a smile, the almost smile that was as far as Rafferty generally went with smiles in difficult weather. "The east end," Beckett said. "The brace is loose. If someone holds it, I can reattach it from above." She held the brace. She held it for 40 minutes in the driving snow, while Beckett worked from above and Rafferty moved around the perimeter of the structure, doing the things that needed to be done there. The cold was extraordinary, the kind of cold that announces itself as a fact rather than a sensation that communicates in terms of what the body can and cannot do rather than what it feels. Her hands inside the oversized gloves went numb and then stopped reporting on their own condition. When it was done, Beckett came down from the roof and looked at the repair and then looked at her. She was covered in snow. Her nose had gone red. She was holding her hands against her sides with the instinctive desire to warm them that the gloves were no longer managing. He said nothing. He walked to the door of the main barn, pulled it open, and held it. She went inside. The barn was warm with the heat of the animals, the profound animal warmth of large creatures in an enclosed space, the smell of hay and horse, and the particular sweetness of cattle. Beckett came in behind her. He went to the back wall and came back with a horse blanket, which he handed to her without comment. She wrapped it around her shoulders. She looked at the horses in their stalls. One of them, Chester, regarded her with the patient recognition of an animal that has decided she is acceptable. Then Beckett reached out and took her hands. He held them between both of his, not with the tentative carefulness of a man worried about overstepping, but with the practical directness of a man doing something necessary, and he chafed them gently to bring the circulation back. His hands were also cold, but they were large, and the friction between them generated heat, and after a minute she could feel her fingers again. "Better," he said. "Yes," she said. He did not release her hands immediately. He held them a moment longer, and they were both looking at their hands, not at each other, and the barn was warm around them, and the storm moved across the roof with a sound like the whole sky dragging itself across the mountain. Then he let go. "Thank you," he said, "for holding the brace." "Thank you," she said, "for letting me." He looked at her then. The amber of his eyes in the dim barn light was something she did not yet have a word for. She suspected she would find one eventually. There was time. It was Fletcher who brought the information back from Bear Creek. He had made the trip in the first clearer window after the storm broke, going into town for supplies, and returning in the late afternoon of the following day with news that he delivered to his brothers that evening after supper in the sitting room, in the careful manner of a man who has been thinking about how to say something for 15 miles on horseback. He told them what he had heard from the supply merchant who had it from the freight driver who came through from Denver about a legal matter involving a Boston family named Hartwell, an inheritance in dispute, a guardianship provision that a man named Cornelius was apparently preparing to enforce. He told them the details as he understood them. He told them the deadline, January 1st, 1878. Beckett listened with his hands flat on his knees. Rafferty listened, looking at the fire. Fletcher finished and the room was quiet for a moment, with the weight of information settling into it. Then Beckett said, "We tell her, in the morning, all of it." Fletcher nodded. Rafferty said everything. They were agreed. That was what the Calloway brothers did with things that needed to be done. They agreed without ceremony, and then they did them. In the morning, Josie came to the kitchen and found all three of them already at the table. Beckett poured her coffee without being asked. The ledger was not out. The ordinary props of a working morning had been set aside. She looked at the three of them and understood from the particular quality of their collective stillness that something was about to be said. She sat down. Fletcher told her what he had heard. He told it the way he told most things, directly, without embellishment, laying the facts in front of her, the way a man lays tools on a workbench, organized and available, and trusting her to know what to do with them. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she looked at the table surface for a moment. Then she looked up and she looked at each of the three men in turn, and she said, "I should tell you the whole of it, not just the outline, all of it." Rafferty said quietly, "You do not have to." "I want to," she said, and she discovered saying it that it was true. She told them everything wrong. She told them about the will and the clause and the deliberate obscuring of its meaning. She told them about the 6 months in Cornelius's house, about the locked doors and the controlled movements, and the slow, methodical erosion of everything she had been before her father died. She told them about the money she had saved coin by coin in the lining of her coat. She told them about the letter in the leather case, and the others beside it, the record she had been keeping. She told them about the night that she sent her reply to Calloway Ranch. When she finished, the room was quiet. Not the silence of people who do not know what to say, but the silence of people who are sitting with what has been said and giving it the respect of their full attention. Then Beckett asked the question she had been carrying since the first time he asked it, the question that had been shaping her thinking for weeks. "What do you want, Josie?" "Not what is practical, not what we think. What do you want?" She looked at him. She looked at the question. She had been working on the answer since October. "I want to stop running," she said. "I want to stand somewhere and not be moved from it." She paused. "I want to handle this myself, not to have it handled for me." The three brothers said nothing, but something passed between them, some wordless current of communication that she was beginning to learn to read, and what it said was agreed. "Then tell us," Fletcher said, "what you need from us." She told him. Cornelius Hartwell arrived in Bear Creek on a Tuesday morning in the first week of January 1877, and the town knew he was coming before he arrived. This was not unusual. Bear Creek was small enough that a stranger on the road from the south was visible for a considerable distance, and the freight driver who had passed the party on the trail the evening before had mentioned it at the saloon, and by morning the information had moved through the town, the way information always moved in small places, quietly and completely, so that by the time the hired coach from Denver rolled down the main street and stopped in front of the sheriff's office, Sheriff Gideon Bassett was already standing on his porch with his coffee watching. There were two of them. The first man to step down from the coach was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that communicated money without ostentation. His coat was a dark charcoal wool. His hat was new. His boots had been recently polished and had already acquired a thin film of Montana road dust that he did not appear to have noticed, but that Bassett had, because Bassett noticed things like that. His face was the face of a man accustomed to being agreed with, not a cruel face precisely, but a controlled one. The face of someone who has spent a long time arranging things to his satisfaction and expects that arrangement to continue. The second man was younger, thin, carrying a leather document case with both hands, and had the look of someone whose primary professional skill was producing the correct piece of paper at the correct moment. Bassett finished his coffee. Cornelius Hartwell presented himself at the sheriff's office with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing before in other jurisdictions and found it generally straightforward. He explained his situation. He was the legal guardian of one Eleanor Josephine Hartwell, 23 years old, unmarried, who had been residing on the Calloway Ranch property approximately 4 miles north of Bear Creek since September of the previous year. He held as her guardian under the terms of her father's will a legitimate interest in her welfare and her legal status. He had reason to believe her current living situation constituted an irregularity that fell within the purview of the guardianship provisions. He said all of this pleasantly with the tone of a man who is simply clarifying a situation that has gotten slightly out of hand. Bassett listened. He asked 3 questions, received 3 answers that were technically complete, and told the man he would send word up to the Calloway Ranch. Cornelius thanked him and went to find a room. The rider Bassett sent reached Calloway Ranch before noon. Josie was in the kitchen when Beckett came in and told her. She was making bread. She had been making bread every Tuesday for the past 6 weeks and had progressed from a product that could be described charitably as dense to one that Fletcher had 2 weeks ago eaten 3 slices of in a single sitting without comment, which she had interpreted correctly as praise. Her hands were in the dough when Beckett came through the door, and she read the news in his face before he said a word because she had become in 4 months at this ranch very good at reading the faces of men who did not perform their feelings. She took her hands out of the dough. She was still for a moment. She was aware of the old reflex, the pulling inward, the automatic calculation of exits and options, and the fastest route to somewhere else. She felt it move through her the way a cold front moves through a valley fast, in total, and changing everything in its passage. Then she felt it pass. She washed her hands in the basin. She dried them on the cloth hanging from the oven handle. She turned around. Where, she said. Town, Beckett said. He's at the hotel. Has he been to the sheriff? First thing. She nodded. She reached for her coat, which hung on the peg by the door. I want to meet him in Bassett's office, she said. Here, not on this ground. She pulled the coat on. I want all 3 of you there. Not to speak for me, just to be there. Beckett looked at her for a moment with the look she had come to know, the one that assessed and found what it was looking for. He said, This afternoon, she said, I have bread to finish first. She went back to the dough. Behind her, she heard Beckett cross to the door of the sitting room and say with the particular economy of a man who does not repeat himself, Fletcher Rafferty. She spent the remainder of the morning in a state of focused calm that she recognized as the condition she reached when there was nothing left to do but act. She had been in this state before on the night she packed the valise on the morning she walked to the post office in the Boston cold. It was not courage exactly. It was something more practical than courage, the simple arithmetic of a person who has looked at the available options and selected the one that moves forward. She finished the bread. She changed into the better of her 2 dresses, the dark blue wool that Harriet had helped her make from the fabric she had purchased in October. She pinned her hair up with the particular care she took with it when she needed to feel that she had not been reduced. She retrieved the leather case from under her bed. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the case and went through its contents methodically. The letters from Cornelius, 6 of them spanning the period from April to December of the previous year, ranging in tone from the initial almost mild notice of guardianship expectations to the final letter, the one that had arrived in September and contained between its careful lines what amounted to a threat. She had kept them all. She had kept them because her father had taught her without meaning to that paper was evidence, and evidence was the foundation of any argument worth making. The documentation she had received through Harriet's Denver contact from the attorney named Whitmore, who specialized in property law and the rights of women under Colorado territorial statutes. She had been corresponding with Whitmore since October quietly in letters she had sent through Harriet's address rather than the Calloway Ranch, and what Whitmore had sent her in return had taken 3 weeks to arrive and had reorganized her understanding of her own situation considerably. She read through the relevant sections one more time the way a person reviews a map before entering unfamiliar terrain. Then she closed the case. She stood up. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, the face of a woman who had arrived in Montana territory 4 months ago with a flinch she could not control and one bag, and she looked at that face carefully, the way she had learned to look at things here without romanticism and without despair. She picked up the case and went out to where the brothers were waiting. The ride into Bear Creek took 40 minutes, and they made it mostly in silence, which was the Calloway way of preparing for something, and which Josie had come to find over the course of 4 months, neither isolating nor uncomfortable, but simply honest. These were men who did not fill silence with noise for the sake of filling it. When they spoke, it was because they had something to say, and the silence between the words had the same quality as good timber, solid and weight-bearing. Bassett met them at the door of his office. He was a rangy man in his late 40s, with a deputy's instinct for reading a room before he entered it, and he read this particular group, 4 people arriving, with the compact purposefulness of people who have talked through a plan and agreed on it, and he nodded and held the door. Cornelius was already inside, seated in the chair across from Bassett's desk. His lawyer, Aldous Webb, stood to one side with the document case. Cornelius rose when they entered with the practiced courtesy of a man who uses courtesy the way other people use furniture to establish the shape of a room. He looked at Josie. She looked back. She did not look at Beckett or Fletcher or Rafferty. She walked to the chair on her side of Bassett's desk and sat down and placed the leather case on the desk in front of her. She folded her hands on top of it. She met Cornelius Hartwell's eyes across the room, and she held the look without flinching, which was not something she had been able to do in March or April, or any of the months that followed, and which she was doing now, not for any particular effect, but simply because it was the most honest position available to her. Cornelius looked at the leather case. He looked at the 3 large men standing behind Josie's chair, not positioned with any aggression, just present the way 3 mountains are present when they are behind you. He looked back at Josie. "Eleanor," he said. "Josie," she said. "A small thing, but not a small thing." He presented his case with the smooth fluency of a man who had rehearsed it. The guardianship, the provisions, the irregularity of her current living situation. He did not use harsh language. He framed everything in terms of concern, his concern for her welfare, his obligations under the will, the unfortunate necessity of addressing the matter formally given her failure to respond appropriately to his previous correspondence. Josie let him finish. Then she opened the leather case and placed the first document on Bassett's desk. "This," she said, "is a correspondence from attorney Nathaniel Whitmore of Denver regarding the guardianship provisions of my father's will under Colorado territorial law." She placed the second document beside it. "This is Mr. Whitmore's assessment of those provisions in light of the amended property statutes that took effect in the territory in 1875. She placed the third, "And these are 6 letters written to me by my guardian over the past 9 months, the language of which Mr. Whitmore describes as constituting in aggregate a pattern of coercive correspondence inconsistent with the fiduciary responsibilities of a legal guardian." She looked at Cornelius. "The financial provision," she said, "the clause specifying the transfer of control of my father's estate to you in the event of my failure to marry by January 1st, 1878, is a provision that Mr. Whitmore believes is actionable under the new statutes. Specifically, the clause was inserted into a document that my father signed without adequate explanation of its terms in the presence of the primary beneficiary of that clause, which is to say yourself." The room was quiet. Cornelius's expression had not changed. This impressed her in a detached way. He was very good at not changing his expression. "Furthermore," she said, "a preliminary review of the estate accounts managed under your guardianship has identified a pattern of expenditure that Mr. Whitmore would like to examine in greater detail. Funds drawn against the estate for what are characterized in the ledgers as estate management expenses, the nature of which does not appear to correspond to any service rendered on behalf of the estate." Now his expression changed, just slightly, just enough. I am not here to make accusations," she said. "I am here to inform you that I am aware of my situation, fully aware, and that the circumstances you believe you are arriving to find are not the circumstances you have found." Bassett behind his desk was very still in the way of a man who is paying extremely close attention and has decided the wisest thing he can do is continue paying attention and say nothing. Cornelius looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the documents. Then he looked at Webb, who gave a small, nearly invisible shake of his head that communicated something between them in the private language of men who have worked together long enough to speak without speaking. Then Cornelius looked at the three brothers behind Josie's chair. "You are residing," he said with the measured care of a man choosing his terrain, "with three unmarried men to whom you bear no legal relationship. Under the terms of the guardianship, this is a matter I am entitled to address." He paused. "Specifically, I would ask who among these men is your husband, if any, and whether that can be demonstrated to the satisfaction of this office." The question landed in the room and sat there. Josie had anticipated this. She had thought through this particular move in the correspondence with Whitmore, in the careful review of her options, in the long hours of planning that she had conducted with the clarity of a woman who has had enough of being caught unprepared. She opened her mouth to answer. Beckett stood up. He had been standing behind her chair, still and silent the way he was still and silent when he was doing the thing that Beckett Calloway did best, which was simply being present, large and immovable, and entirely himself. Now he stood up fully, which meant that he occupied rather more of the room than he had before, and he looked at Cornelius Hartwell across the space between them, and he said, in the flat, certain voice of a man stating an observable fact, "She is my wife." The room held the words. Josie did not look at Beckett, she looked at Cornelius. She watched the calculation move across his face, the rapid assessment of what this changed and what it did not change, and what his next available move was. Webb leaned toward his employer and said something in a very low voice. Cornelius straightened. He looked at Bassett. "I will need to verify this," he said. "Verification is available," Josie said. She reached into the leather case and produced the last document, the one she had prepared most recently, the one that still smelled faintly of the ink she had pressed with particular care. "Mr. Whitmore has prepared a summary of the legal protections afforded to a married woman under Colorado territorial law with respect to guardianship claims." She placed it on the desk. "I thought it might be relevant." Bassett looked at this document. He looked at Josie. He looked at Beckett. He looked at Cornelius. He said with the calm of a man who has been a sheriff long enough to recognize when a situation has resolved itself without requiring his direct intervention, "Mr. Hartwell, I think you might want to speak with your lawyer before we continue." Cornelius looked at the documents on Bassett's desk for a long moment. Then he looked at Webb, and Webb gave a slight shake of his head. Cornelius straightened his coat. He said with the composure of a man who has not yet decided to concede, but has decided to pause, that he would be in touch through the appropriate channels. He picked up his hat. He left. The room was quiet after the door closed. Bassett looked at Josie. He said nothing, but he picked up the documents she had placed on his desk and aligned their edges with a care that communicated without words that he intended to keep them somewhere safe. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light. The four of them, and the silence on the return journey was a different kind of silence than the one on the way out. Not the silence of preparation. The silence of something that has been held at tension for a long time and has not yet fully understood that the tension has eased. That evening after supper, Beckett asked to speak with Josie alone in the kitchen. Fletcher and Rafferty gave no indication of having heard this, but within 2 minutes they were both in the barn, doing things that evidently could not wait until morning. Josie sat at the table. Beckett sat across from her. He had his hands flat on the table surface, the way he sat when he was about to say something he had thought through carefully. "What I said today," he began, "in Bassett's office, I want you to understand why I said it." "You were protecting the position," she said. "No," he said. He said it with a directness that stopped her. "That was not why." She looked at him. "I have been thinking," he said, "since October. Since earlier than that, if I am being honest, and I would rather be honest." He looked at his hands on the table. I placed an advertisement because the ranch needed managing. That was the truth as I understood it at the time. It may not have been the whole truth. The fire was low. Outside, the January darkness had settled over the valley, deep and clear and cold. What I want to say, he said, is this. I would like to marry you, not to protect a legal position, not because of your uncle or his deadlines or any of the particulars of the situation we are in. He paused. I would like to marry you because in 4 months you have become the thing in this house that makes it different from what it was before. And I find that I do not want to go back to what it was before. Josie was quiet for a moment. And Fletcher, she said, and Rafferty? They know, he said. They agree. She looked at him across the table, this man of very few words, who had just used more of them in the past 2 minutes than she had heard him use in a single conversation since she arrived. And she thought about the lock on her door and the book handed down from the shelf and the hands chafing warmth back into her frozen fingers in the barn, and she thought about what she had told him she wanted standing somewhere and not being moved from it. Beckett, she said, I do not want to marry to escape. I came here once already running from something. I cannot do that again. He was quiet. If I marry you, she said, it will be because I choose it, not because Cornelius has forced the choice. That is the only version I am offering, Ramon, he said. The choosing kind, Dad. She looked at the table. She looked at the fire. She looked at the door that led out to the hallway where the bedroom with the lock on it was the lock that Rafferty had walked 3 miles to buy. Give me until morning, she said. He nodded. He stood up. He refilled her coffee from the pot on the stove. He went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the coffee and the fire and the Montana winter pressing against the windows, and she thought about all of it. The whole of it laid out plain. And when she finally went to her room and lay in the dark listening to the sound of the house settling around her, she knew what the morning would bring. She told them at breakfast. All 3 of them were at the table when she came in, which was not unusual, but the particular quality of their attention when she sat down told her they had been up for a while and had probably said very little to each other in the interim. Beckett poured her coffee. Rafferty passed the bread. Fletcher looked at his plate. I will do it, she said, but on my terms. And I need you to hear what those terms are. She looked at each of them. This is not a marriage to outmaneuver Cornelius. It is not a legal mechanism. If we do this, we do it honestly, and we give it 60 days of genuine effort to become what it ought to be. At the end of 60 days, if either of us finds that we have been wrong about what we wanted, we address that honestly too. She paused. I will not be managed. I will not be handled. I will be treated as a person with her own mind and her own decisions, or this will not work. She stopped. Fletcher said without looking up from his plate, You just negotiated the terms of a marriage like a cattle contract, Josie Hartwell. I learned from the best, she said. She looked at Fletcher when she said it. He looked up. For a moment, he held the look. And then something happened that she had not seen from Fletcher in 4 months of careful observation. He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the barely there rearrangement of features that was as far as Fletcher Calloway generally allowed himself to go. A real one, brief and sudden like light through a gap in heavy cloud. Agreed, he said. Rafferty said agreed. Beckett said nothing, but he looked at her across the table with the amber eyes that she had been learning to read for 4 months, and what they said was the same thing they always said, which was that he was present completely and without reservation, and that he had no intention of going anywhere. Agreed, she said. The ceremony took place 3 days later on a Friday morning at the office of Reverend Elias Cooper, who conducted services at the Bear Creek Church on the first and third Sundays of each month, and who received the request for a weekday civil ceremony with the equanimity of a man who has performed frontier marriages in enough unusual circumstances to find the usual ones almost disappointing. Harriet Doyle was there. Sheriff Bassett was there at Josie's specific request because she wanted every element of the proceedings documented clearly and by someone with the official standing to document it. Fletcher and Rafferty stood on either side of the room. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Cooper said the necessary words. Beckett said the necessary words. Josie said hers. When it was done and Cooper had produced the certificate and Bassett had signed as witness, and the paper had been folded and placed in the leather case with everything else, they came out of the office into the January morning, into the thin, bright light of a Montana winter day, the air sharp and clean, the mountains white against a pale blue sky. Cornelius Hartwell was standing across the street. He had been there for some time, evidently. He had his hands in his coat pockets and his lawyer at his shoulder, and he watched them come out with the expression of a man reassessing his position. He crossed the street. He stopped in front of Josie. He said, "Eleanor," and then with a slight, carefully measured pause, "You are making a mistake." She looked at him. She had thought for months about what she would say to him if she ever had the opportunity to say it freely, without the architecture of his house around her, and the understanding of what he was capable of pressing against the back of her neck. She had composed speeches in her head on the long ride west, and in the quiet mornings on the ranch house porch, and in the evenings at the kitchen table when the fire was low and the house was still. She said none of those speeches. She said, "No, Cornelius, the mistake was mine and it lasted 6 months. It ended this morning." His jaw tightened. "I will find another avenue," he said very low for her alone. And then Rafferty moved. Not aggressively, not with any drama. He simply stepped forward from where he had been standing at the edge of the group and positioned himself at Josie's left shoulder, and he looked at Cornelius Hartwell with the steady, uncomplicated gaze of a man who has sat through the worst night of his life and found on the other side of it that there is very little left that can frighten him. "Mr. Hartwell," Rafferty said, his voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that carries further than a raised voice, the kind that fills a space completely because there is nothing competing with it. "She has a husband. She is of legal age. She is standing on the ground of people who intend to keep her on it." He paused. "Sheriff Bassett is 20 feet away." Cornelius looked at Rafferty, he looked at Beckett, he looked at Fletcher, he looked at Josie. He turned and walked back to where his coach was waiting. Josie watched him go. She watched until the coach was moving and the dust had begun to settle around its wheels, and she watched the lawyer Webb in the last moment before the door closed bend over his document case and write something down. Cornelius was not finished. She knew it with the certainty of someone who has spent 6 months studying the way a particular man operates. He was not finished. He had simply changed the approach. She turned back to the others. Harriet was watching her with the look of a woman who also knows things are not finished, but considers the present moment worth inhabiting regardless. "Well," Harriet said, "you are married. That seems like something worth a decent meal." 6 weeks passed. They were not simple weeks. They were not uncomplicated ones. But they were weeks with a shape to them that felt different from any shape Josie had lived inside before, and the difference was at its core, the difference between a life in which she was always bracing for what came next and a life in which she was not. Beckett was careful with her in the way that people are careful with things they have decided matter. He did not change his manner dramatically. He was still a man of few words and direct action in the particular brand of attention that expressed itself through presence rather than declaration. But there were small things. Coffee brought without asking. The easier trail taken on the morning rides without any acknowledgement that the easier trail was being taken. A book left on the table by the sitting room chair with no indication of who had put it there, and which she recognized from his careful annotation in the margins in pencil as one he had read more than once. They were beginning to learn the particular language of people who are choosing deliberately and without guarantee to trust each other. It was Fletcher who brought back the news from town on a gray Wednesday in the middle of February that changed the shape of what they were doing. He had gone in for supplies and had returned in the late afternoon with the information tucked inside his expression where Josie had learned to look for things Fletcher was not yet ready to say directly. He asked her before supper to come into the office. He told her about the communication Bassett had received from Cornelius's lawyer. The argument was this: the marriage between Josie and Beckett had been arranged. Webb contended not out of genuine intention, but as a legal mechanism to circumvent the guardianship provisions. As evidence, Webb cited the testimony of two Bear Creek residents who had been present at the sheriff's office meeting and had heard Beckett identify Josie as his wife at a point in time prior to the marriage ceremony. This, Webb argued, demonstrated that the declaration had been strategic rather than sincere, and that the marriage itself was therefore a construct rather than a genuine union, and should be subject to review by the Denver courts. If the court agreed the marriage could potentially be dissolved retroactively, Josie sat with this for a moment. "He is not wrong," she said, about the sequence of events. "No," Fletcher said. "He is wrong about everything else." Fletcher looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "he is." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she had told Beckett the morning she agreed. "We do it honestly, and we give it 60 days of genuine effort to become what it ought to be." She thought about 6 weeks of careful mornings and lit fires and books with pencil annotations and hands that moved with steadiness rather than violence through every shared hour of every shared day. "Then we will have to demonstrate that," she said. She opened the leather case. They sat around the kitchen table that evening, all four of them with the fire lower than it should have been, because no one had tended it, because the tending of fires had been set aside in favor of the problem on the table in front of them. Fletcher had said his piece. Beckett had listened. Rafferty had listened. Now the room held the weight of what had been said, and the fire put out what light it could, and outside the February wind moved across the valley with the particular voice of midwinter, low and without mercy and utterly indifferent. Fletcher said, "He is not wrong technically. The marriage was proposed as a solution to a legal problem." Beckett said, "It stopped being that some time ago." He said it without emphasis. He said it the way he said things he was certain of, flatly and directly, as though the thing spoke for itself and needed no supporting argument. He looked at Josie when he said it. She looked at him. He said, "I do not want to end this marriage, not for legal reasons and not for any other reason. I want it to continue because I want it to continue. That is the entirety of my position." Josie turned to Rafferty. Rafferty was looking at the table. He said, "Since you came, I have been able to look at Rosalind's clock without feeling like I am looking at something I failed." He said it quietly, the way he said everything, with the careful precision of a man who has thought hard about words because he knows he does not use many of them. "That is not a small thing. For me, it is not a small thing." She turned to Fletcher. Fletcher looked at the window. He did not look at her when he spoke, which was she had learned how Fletcher spoke when he was saying something that cost him something. "I thought you would leave from the first day," he said. "I thought it every day for 2 months. I was wrong. I have been wrong about things before, and generally I do not say so, but I am saying so now." He paused. "I do not want you to leave." Josie looked down at her hands on the table. She thought about the flinch, the one that had moved through her on the platform in Bear Creek in September, the one that she could not control, that had happened before she understood anything about this place or these people. She thought about how many times she had expected the flinch and found that it was not needed. The accumulation of all those moments when the thing she had braced for had not arrived, and the slow structural change that accumulation had made in the architecture of how she understood herself to be in the world. She looked up. She said, "If we are going to prove this is a genuine marriage, then I think we should be honest about what it has become. Not what we intended it to be in January. What it actually is now." Beckett said, "What is it now?" "It is real," she said. "At least for me it is real." The fire settled. A log shifted. The February wind moved across the valley. Beckett reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Not tentatively, not with the careful telegraphing of a man managing her fear, simply the way he did everything with the directness and the weight of something decided and meant. She turned her hand over and held his. The plan was hers, and she built it the way she had built every useful thing in the past 4 months, methodically and without sentiment, and with a clear accounting of what was available and what was needed. Harriet provided the connection to Nathaniel Whitmore in Denver, who had been advising Josie since October, and who proved when Josie wrote to him with the details of Webb's challenge to be exactly the kind of lawyer who is energized rather than discouraged by complexity. He wrote back within the week with a framework for response. Fletcher provided this financial documentation. He was the one who had kept the ranch accounts for years, who understood the ledgers, who knew where every entry came from and where it went. And when Josie told him what she needed him to help her find, he sat down with the accounts from the Boston estate and he worked through them with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. And what he found by the end of 3 evenings of careful work was exactly what she had suspected. Cornelius had drawn against the estate, against Josie's inheritance, against funds that were not his to draw against, and had characterized those withdrawals in terms that were designed to be defensible if examined casually and indefensible if examined carefully. Fletcher examined them carefully. "That is not estate management," he said when he had finished. "No," Josie agreed, "it is not." She wrote to Whitmore with the figures. She also wrote on a separate evening a letter to the Denver Post. She wrote it the way she had written the correspondence with Whitmore, plainly and without embellishment, laying out the facts in order and allowing the facts to make the argument without assistance. She was not an aggrieved woman pleading for sympathy. She was a person in possession of information presenting it. She read the letter twice after she had written it. She made 2 corrections. She sealed it and gave it to Harriet to post. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of February. Fletcher drove her to Denver. It took 2 days on the road with a night at the relay station south of the pass, and they traveled mostly in silence, which was not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of 2 people who have established enough of a language between them that not speaking is one of the things they can do in each other's company. At the relay station, over a meal that was adequate rather than good, Fletcher said without particular preamble, "You will do well tomorrow." She looked at him. "You think clearly under pressure," he said. "I have watched you do it. Most people do not." She thought about the office in November and the draft lever on the stove and the ledger error and all the particular ways Fletcher Calloway communicated information rather than judgment. "You have taught me something about that," she said. He looked at his coffee. "Whitmore will be there," he said. "You know the material. Webb's argument rests on sequence and intent, and you can address both." "I know," she said. "Then you are ready." She thought about it. She thought about everything that had brought her to a relay station south of a Denver mountain pass in February of 1877, every letter and every morning on the porch, and every lesson and every small accretive act of choosing to stay. She thought about the lock on her door. She thought about the hand over hers on the kitchen table without hesitation or caveat. "Yes," she said, "I am." In the Denver hearing room, Josie sat across a table from Webb and before a territorial magistrate named Holbrook, who had been presiding over property and domestic proceedings for 12 years, and who looked from the moment she sat down like a man who had made his assessment of the relative merits of the positions before him and was working through the formalities before delivering what he had already concluded. Webb presented his case. He was organized and precise and built his argument from the documented sequence of events with the skill of a lawyer who understands that narrative is the most powerful legal tool available. Josie presented hers. She presented the original guardianship documents and Whitmore's analysis of their provisions under current territorial law. She presented the correspondence from Cornelius, all 6 letters with Whitmore's annotation of the language that constituted coercion under the relevant statute. She presented the financial documentation, 14 pages of carefully organized figures that Fletcher had extracted from the estate accounts and cross-referenced with the ranch ledgers, demonstrating a pattern of withdrawal that had no defensible relationship to estate management services. Webb objected twice. Holbrook acknowledged both objections and returned to the documents. At the end of the hearing, Holbrook set down his pen. He said that the guardianship provisions, as they applied to the current circumstances, had been substantially superseded by the marriage of January 1877, that the challenge to that marriage on the grounds of fraud was not supported by the evidence presented, and that the financial documentation presented by the respondent's counsel would be referred to the appropriate office for further review. He said that the matter of the inheritance was to be considered the property of Josephine Calloway, formerly Hartwell, and that no further guardianship claims were applicable. He closed his file. Josie sat for a moment in the chair. She was aware of Whitmore to her left, who was making notes with the businesslike satisfaction of a lawyer whose argument has been accepted. She was aware of Webb across the table, who was reclosing his document case with the particular efficiency of a man who has already moved on to the next thing. She was aware of the sounds of the building around her, the ordinary sounds of a building full of ordinary proceedings, doors and voices and footsteps, and all the unremarkable noise of a world continuing to operate. She was aware that it was over. She stood up. She shook Whitmore's hand. She walked out of the hearing room into the corridor, and Fletcher was there standing against the wall with his hat in his hands, watching the door. He looked at her face. He read it the way he read most things, accurately and immediately. "You won," he said. "We won," she said. "You found the financial records." He looked at the floor. "You knew where to look. You knew how to document what we found." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Good." It was from Fletcher Calloway, an expression of profound satisfaction. They walked out of the building into the Denver winter, into the particular cold of a city that does not have the mountain wind to blame it on, and she stood on the steps for a moment and looked at the street in front of her. The ordinary busy street of a western city going about its business. And she thought about Boston and the locked doors and the single valise and the coin-by-coin savings in the lining of a coat. And she thought about all of it, and she let it sit in her mind for a moment, its full weight and its full distance. Then she walked down the steps. They had 2 days on the road back to Bear Creek, and then 4 miles up the valley, and then the ranch house on the bench above the trees and the people in it who were waiting. She was ready to go home. When they arrived at the ranch, Beckett and Rafferty were both in the yard. They had not been told when to expect the wagon, but they were there regardless, which told Josie something about the nature of waiting when the waiting matters. Beckett was at the fence with his arms resting on the top rail, and Rafferty was near the barn door, and neither of them moved when the wagon rolled into the yard. They simply watched her climb down. She climbed down without assistance. She had been doing this for months now, and her body knew the motion, but Beckett watched anyway, and what she saw on his face when she landed steadily on the frozen ground was not relief exactly. It was something quieter than relief. The particular stillness of a man who has been carrying a thing and has just been allowed to set it down. Fletcher took the wagon to the barn. Rafferty went with him, which left Josie and Beckett alone in the yard in the thin late afternoon light, with the mountains behind the house gone rose and amber in the last hour before dark. Beckett said, "You did not need us." It was an observation the way most things he said were observations stated without complaint or wounded pride, simply as a fact he was placing on the table between them. "No," she said, "I did not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then why did you stay?" She looked at him. She had been thinking about this question since the relay station south of the pass, since the moment Fletcher had said, "You are ready," and she had understood that he was right, and had also understood that being ready to fight alone and choosing to fight with people beside you were not the same thing. Because needing someone and choosing someone are entirely different things, she said. "I came here because I needed. I stayed because I chose." The yard was very still around them. A horse moved in the barn. The wind off the peaks was cold and clean and smelled of pine and coming snow. Beckett looked at her for a long time. Then he said simply, "Good." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without decoration, without performance. He walked to where she was standing, and he held out his hand, and she took it, and they went inside. That night, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table and ate a meal that Rafferty had prepared in their absence, a pot roast that had been going since morning, and filled the house with a smell so deeply domestic, so entirely the smell of people caring for each other through the ordinary acts of daily life, that Josie had to sit with it for a moment when she first came through the door. Nobody talked about the hearing. Nobody talked about Cornelius or Webb or Whitmore or the documents now safely folded in the leather case. They talked about the Anderson family, whose youngest had finally cut his first tooth. They talked about the spring cattle plan, which Fletcher had been developing in their absence, and which he presented with his characteristic directness a series of practical decisions laid out for collective consideration. They talked about the clock on the shelf above the fireplace, Rosalind's clock, which Rafferty had finally finished and which now ticked with a sound so steady and so quiet that you only noticed it when the room was otherwise completely still. After supper, after the dishes had been washed and put away, and Fletcher and Rafferty had gone to bed, Josie sat for a while longer at the kitchen table with the last of her coffee and that quiet, regular sound, and she thought about a girl named Rosalind who had kept a clock on her windowsill because the sound of it helped her sleep, and she thought about what it meant that the clock was working again, and she thought that some things broken at the worst possible moment can be repaired if the person who loves them is willing to sit with the small pieces long enough. Spring came to Bear Creek the way it always did in the mountain country, tentatively at first, and then all at once the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes to reveal the first tentative green. Underneath the creek coming up with snow melt and running fast and cold and clear, the animals restless with the change in the air. Josie noticed it from the porch, the same way she had noticed everything else since she arrived fully, and with the particular attention of someone who has spent a long time in a world too small to notice anything at all. The ranch expanded that spring. The decision had been made around the kitchen table over several evenings in March. Josie presenting figures and projections with the same directness she had learned from Fletcher, all three brothers listening and asking questions, and then agreeing. The 40 additional acres that became part of Calloway Ranch in April of 1877 were purchased in part with what remained of Josie's inheritance after the legal proceedings. Her suggestion, her arithmetic, her choice, and the three brothers had accepted it, the way they accepted most things she offered them, without excess and without pretense, as a practical fact about how the future was going to be built. Bear Creek began to call her Mrs. Calloway that spring, and not merely as a courtesy. She had started teaching 2 afternoons a week the children of 3 neighboring families gathered at the Anderson kitchen table with whatever books she could assemble, and the town had noticed. She was no longer the mail-order bride from Boston. She was the woman who corrected the county tax assessment and taught the Anderson children their sums and rode astride on a mountain trail without flinching. She was someone who belonged here. She was beginning to believe it herself. The summer of 1877 passed the way good summers do in the high country, in the particular rhythm of hard work and long light, in the knowledge that it will not last, that the mountain calendar does not accommodate sentiment. Josie learned to shoot that summer, Beckett teaching her in the same way he had taught her to ride with patience and without apology for the gap between what she knew and what the work required. She was a good student. She had always been a good student. She simply needed to be taught by someone who trusted her to learn. In September, Rafferty came to her. She was in the kitchen garden, which she had established in May, in the south-facing plot beside the house, and which had by September produced more than she had honestly expected, and which she was quietly pleased about in the way she was quietly pleased about most things she built from nothing. Rafferty stood at the edge of the garden for a moment before he spoke, which was how Rafferty always approached things he was uncertain about. "There is a woman in the town," he said, "the doctor's daughter, Winifred Holbrook." He stopped. Josie straightened up and looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her. "I have been noticing her since last winter," he said. "I don't know what to do with that." Josie pulled off her garden gloves. She thought about Rafferty on the wagon bench in September of last year, looking at the mountains carrying something she now understood completely. She thought about a clock on a windowsill and the particular courage it takes to try again after the worst possible thing. "What does she do?" Josie said. "She helps her father," he said, "with the patients. She is not afraid of difficult things." "Then she sounds like someone worth knowing," Josie said. "Go introduce yourself." He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen across a kitchen table over a cracked carriage clock, the one that was not quite wonder and not quite recognition. He nodded. He went. Fletcher drove Rafferty into town the following Saturday without being asked, which was how Fletcher communicated support through the practical fact of his presence and a wagon ready at the right time. He did not say anything about it when he came back, He simply came in and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and opened the ledger, and the ordinary sounds of the house continued around him. Rafferty and Winifred Holbrook were married in October of 1877 on a Thursday afternoon at the Bear Creek Church with most of the valley present, because that was how Winifred's father preferred it, and Winifred did not disagree. The ceremony was longer than Beckett and Josie's had been more formal, with all the customary words spoken in the customary order by Reverend Cooper, who by now had developed an evident fondness for the Calloway family in their various occasions. Fletcher stood beside his brothers at the altar, and he looked at the floor through most of the ceremony, and when Josie glanced at him from across the room, she saw him lift his hand once to the corner of his eye and then look away quickly toward the window. She looked away too. Some things were private, even in the middle of a crowd. The winter of 1877 into 1878 was a hard one, harder than the year before, the snow coming early and lying deep through February and into March. But the ranch was better prepared than it had been the previous winter, the woodpile larger, the hay stores fuller, the household arranged for the reality of what Montana winter actually was rather than what an Eastern imagination might expect it to be. Josie had seen to most of this methodically and without drama in the weeks before the first snow. On a morning in late November, she woke early, which was not unusual, and went to the kitchen to start the stove, which was not unusual, and stood for a moment at the kitchen window, looking at the snow on the mountains in the gray pre-dawn light, which was also not unusual. What was unusual was the way she felt. She stood at the window a moment longer, taking account of herself with the same careful attention she brought to the household ledgers, and then she went and sat at the kitchen table and thought about it until Beckett came in from checking the stock, and then she waited until he had his coffee in front of him and was settled at the table, and then she reached across and took his hand and placed it flat on the table between them and put her own hand over it. He looked at her. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She had learned in 14 months of living with this man that he understood a great deal that was never spoken, and that the spoken version was sometimes less accurate than the silence. He sat very still for a long time. Then he stood up and came around the table and sat in the chair beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they sat that way while the stove ticked and the snow held still on the mountains outside, and the house settled quietly around them. Edmund Calloway was born in the spring of 1878 on an April morning when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the light had the particular quality of early spring in the mountains, clear and sharp and full of a kind of promise that did not oversell itself. He was born at the ranch with the doctor up from Bear Creek and Harriet Doyle present, and Winifred Rafferty's wife standing by with the practical competence she had learned from her father. He arrived without complication, which was more than Josie had dared to hope for, and he announced himself with a directness that made Harriet laugh, and the doctor nod with satisfaction. Beckett was outside during the labor by general agreement, which he accepted without argument, though not without difficulty. When Josie was told he could come in, he appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, looking like a man who has been standing in an open field in a storm and is still not entirely certain the storm is over. He came to the bedside and looked at her for a moment, assessing her the way he always assessed things for structural integrity and current condition. And then he looked at the child. She held a small, dark-haired, loudly opinionated person who had just joined the household. He sat on the edge of the bed. He held out one large, careful hand. She put Edmund into it. Beckett held the child with the same hands that had chafed warmth back into her frozen fingers in the barn in November of 1876, the same hands that had steadied her at the bookshelf and helped her down from a hay pile and turned the pages of a natural history that romanticized the wolves. He held the child and looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Josie. "Edmund," she said, "for my father." He nodded. He looked back at the child. He said very quietly so that only she could hear, "Good." And outside the bedroom window, the aspens leafed out in their spring gold, and the creek ran bright and cold down the valley. And 4 miles from the main street of Bear Creek, on a bench of land above the trees in a house that had started as one room in 1858 and had grown steadily since, with the weight of the years and the people in them, a family that had not entirely existed 18 months ago, continued the ordinary and unrepeatable work of becoming itself. Fletcher Calloway was the last of the brothers to find what the others had found, which surprised no one who knew him well, because Fletcher had always operated on his own timeline and in his own manner, and took the opinions of others on such matters as input rather than instruction. He met Clara Merritt in the summer of 1879 at a trading stop south of Billings, where he had gone with a cattle buyer to conclude a sale. She was a widow of 2 years, the wife of a man who had worked the mines and had not survived them, and she had the look of someone who has had the worst thing happen and has since been living with the discovery that she is still standing. Fletcher came home from the trading stop and said nothing about her for 3 weeks. Josie noticed a change in him and said nothing herself, which was the right thing to do, because Fletcher arrived at things in his own time, and pressure applied from outside only slowed the process. On a Sunday afternoon in August, he came and found her in the kitchen and sat down at the table and said with the directness he brought to everything, "There is a woman I would like your opinion of." Josie set down the bowl she was holding. She sat across from him. "Tell me about her," she said. He told her. He told her about the mining widow from Billings, about the quality of her attention and the directness of her speech, and the particular way she had looked at him when he said something she did not agree with, not with anger, but with honest disagreement plainly expressed. He told her that Clara Merritt was not afraid of silence, and was not afraid of hard winters, and was not afraid of men who communicated primarily in useful information, rather than comfortable noise. He stopped. "What do you want to know?" Josie said. "Whether I am wrong," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had taught her about draft levers and county tax formulas, and the specific discipline of looking at a ledger until it told you what you needed to know. And she thought about the almost smile that had finally become a real one, and the moment he had said, "I do not want you to leave." And she thought that Fletcher Calloway was the kind of man who would be wrong about many things in the course of a life, but was not often wrong about the important ones. "Go find out," she said. "That is the only way to know." He married Clara Merritt in the spring of 1880 at the ranch in the way he preferred to do things, simply and without excess. Harriet Doyle was there. The Andersons were there. Rafferty and Winifred were there with their daughter, who was 8 months old, and had Rafferty's quietness and her mother's clear eyes, and showed no interest in sleeping through anything important. Edmund, nearly 2 years old by then, stood between Josie and Beckett with the solemn concentration of a small person who understands that something significant is happening and intends to observe it properly. That summer, in the long evenings that stretched late into the northern Montana dusk, the Calloway Ranch house was full in a way it had not been since Silas Calloway first built it on the bench above the valley and intended it to hold a family. The porch that Beckett had built wider the previous spring held them all on the better evenings, the three brothers and their wives and the children beginning to arrive, and Harriet Doyle, who had been part of this place longer than any of them, sitting in the last of the light, with the mountains going dark behind the peaks and the valley below lit with the last gold of the sun. They did not talk much on those evenings. They were Calloways, but the silence was the good kind, the kind that only exists between people who have been through something together and have come out on the other side, still choosing to sit beside each other at the end of the day. On a summer evening in 1882, 6 years after a stagecoach had rolled to a stop on the main street of Bear Creek, and a young woman had stepped down with one bag and looked first not at the men waiting for her, but at the exits. Josie and Beckett sat on the porch of the ranch house in the long light and watched Edmund, who was 4 years old, chase Rafferty's dog through the meadow below the house with a concentration and enthusiasm that the dog did not entirely share. From inside the house came the sound of Winifred and Clara talking in the kitchen, the ordinary music of women managing a shared space together, punctuated by the higher note of Rafferty and Winifred's daughter demanding something with great urgency. From the direction of the barn came the sounds of Fletcher and Rafferty doing something that involved lumber, and a disagreement about the correct approach conducted in the way the two brothers disagreed without heat, but with considerable specificity. Beckett said, What are you thinking about? She looked at him. He asked her this sometimes in the evenings, not out of social obligation, but out of genuine interest in what was happening in the mind of the person sitting beside him. She had learned to answer honestly. The platform, she said, in Bear Creek, September of 1876. He was quiet, which was his way of asking her to continue. I stood there, she said, and I thought that I had traded one bad situation for a worse one. Three strangers on a mountain, no way back, and no way to know what was ahead. She paused. I was cataloging exits. I noticed, he said. You noticed everything, she said. All three of you, from the first moment. He said, you had until morning to decide, after Harriet came. I had already decided, she said. I just needed the morning to be sure. He looked at her with the amber eyes that she had learned to read over 6 years of mornings and winters, and all the particular weathers a mountain life produces, the eyes that still communicated primarily an observable fact, and still managed without any apparent effort to say considerably more than that. He leaned toward her and pressed his lips to her forehead, which was how he expressed the things he did not have words for, which were the same things he felt most completely. She closed her eyes for a moment and let it settle into her, the weight of where she was and how she had come to be here and what it had cost and what it was worth. Below them, Edmund caught the dog and fell over laughing. The dog stood over him with its tail going and the philosophical expression of an animal that has decided to find this acceptable. The mountains behind the house held their shape against the evening sky, dark and enormous and patient. The way mountains are patient, the way things that have been standing for a very long time understand that the weather will change and the season will change, and the particular small human beings at their base will continue their particular small human business of building and losing and building again. That night, after the children were settled and the house had grown quiet, and Beckett's breathing beside her had deepened into sleep, Josie lay awake for a while the way she sometimes did not, with the old watchful wakefulness of a woman listening for footsteps in a hallway, but with the wakefulness of someone who has something to think about and wants to give it the proper attention. She thought about the leather case under the bed, which she had not opened in 2 years. The letters from Cornelius were still in it, the record she had kept. She did not need them anymore. Cornelius had not reappeared after the Denver hearing, his attention drawn back to Boston by the financial investigation that had followed the magistrate's referral, and the last she had heard from Nathaniel Whitmore. The matter was resolved in a way that left Cornelius considerably less comfortable than he had been before. She did not spend time thinking about this. It was a concluded chapter in a book she had moved on from. She thought instead about a notebook in her desk drawer, the one she had been keeping since the spring. Not the household accounts and not the correspondence she maintained with Whitmore and with 2 other women she had met through his network, women in similar circumstances, who wrote to each other about legal strategies and territorial statutes in the particular work of knowing your own rights. This notebook was different. It was a private record the way the leather case had once been a private record, but what it contained was not evidence of harm. It was evidence of a life. She had written in it that evening, sitting at the kitchen desk after the children were in bed, and the house was settling into its nighttime sounds, and what she had written was this: if I had to write an advertisement for myself the way Beckett wrote one for this house, I would write something like this: wanted a life that does not require constant watching of exits. A home that is a home because the people in it have decided to stay, not because leaving is impossible. Men who are not rescuers. Men who stand beside you while you do the thing yourself and hand you what you need when you need it and do not take credit for the outcome. I would not have known to ask for any of this in September of 1876. I did not have the language for it. I had only the language of survival, which is a useful language, but not the only one. I have more languages now. She had put the notebook back in the drawer and gone to bed, and now she lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the house, the familiar creak and settle of old timber, the breathing of the man beside her, and somewhere in the walls the faint, steady tick of a repaired clock that had once belonged to a girl named Rosalind, who liked the darkest shade of blue and had kept it on her windowsill because the sound of it helped her sleep. The longest journey, Josie thought, is not measured in miles. She had traveled more than 2,000 miles from Boston to Bear Creek, Montana Territory on a stagecoach and a prayer in a single bag. She had traveled much further than that, from the woman who stepped off the coach onto the platform and spent 30 seconds cataloging exits, to the woman who lay in the dark in this house, on this mountain, and felt without qualification or caveat or waiting to see what happened next, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had needed to be here, because she had chosen it. The mountain stood in the dark beyond the window, patient and enormous, and the valley below held its breath between one season and the next. And in the house on the bench above the trees, the ordinary and unrepeatable life continued, full and complicated and entirely her own.